That's Debatable is sponsored by MB&G. MB&G is specialists in the esoteric world of vehicle and furniture warranty insurance, delivering quite marvellous customer service, prompt claims payment, and a highly developed understanding of how to deliver these products in a way that is both compliant with the regulations and attractive to customers. To find out more, call Paul Smith, the Managing Director, on 07887 501 441. That's 07887 501 441. Hello and welcome to That's Debatable, the weekly news podcast of the Free Speech Union.
Hello everyone, hello Tom. We're back again and we're fresh from football triumph last night. So we're recording this a week early. We're in a horrible situation actually where England have just won very decisively against Netherlands. And by the time this goes out, the result of the final will be known. So we're hoping for glory. It's fair to say Tom and I are not the greatest members of the football watching community, but I do get quite excited when we get to this sort of level. Usually it ends in horrible disappointment, but I'm hoping this time maybe we will make it through.
Our commitment to the game is questionable, but our commitment to England is not. So I think that's a fair way of summarising it, isn't it?
Correct.
And we've got no skin in the game anymore either, haven't we, Ben? Because we both lost the sweepstake. But we're very pleased about that, given England is going to be in the final. This is great news for the country.
No, I was rooting for Italy in the FSU staff sweepstake, which did not go very well for me. So I'm happy now to be rooting for England, which is much more natural.
Apparently that's quite surprising because they're quite good at football.
Well, that's what I gathered. But they let me down. Anyway, here we are. We want to talk about the event that was held last week, as it will be when this is broadcast, that we held on the CAS review and the free speech lessons that need to be learned from that report. So rather than looking at the issues that the report dealt with in terms of how the NHS responds to teenage trans patients, as they say they are, we were looking explicitly at the questions of freedom of speech, of whistleblowing, of exposing wrongdoing. It was a really fascinating event. Tom, what did you take away from it? What was the headline that stayed with you afterwards?
A bunch of things, Ben, stuck with me from last week, and it was quite a standout event. Actually, I think it was something probably only the Free Speech Union could do in quite that way. Bring together a panel of people who told the story, not just of the Tavistock, although the Tavistock was at the heart of the conversation, but told the story all the way back to the 2000s, up to pretty much the present day. The story of how free expression and free speech have been squashed in relation to this gender ideology debate. And a reminder, really, of how the times have changed, but not changed. The surprising thing for me was to hear one of those panel members talk about what was happening already in 2007.
Yeah.
And the sort of wargaming you then do in your head is what could we have done differently? Or what could the authorities have done differently? Or how was the culture already going wrong back in 2007? For it then to continue down this track and reach the madness that we are in today. And so it raised all sorts of questions for me about how do you replay those years? What do you change to get a different outcome at the end? And I'll say one more thing in that regard. The golden thread, I think, that went through the night, and there were 5 great panelists, and we'll talk about them in a minute, was we have become, as we know, over the last 20 years, over the last 25 years, far more concerned about safetyism than ever we were before, about risk aversion, about risk management. I used to help at summer camps with children back at the end of the 90s, in fact, in the mid-90s, end 90s, and the beginning of the 2000s. And we were already starting to feel the effect in our briefings and in our protocols of this change. And it was all for the good, because top of the list of concerns, because these summer camps involve children, top of the list of these concerns was child protection, safety. The last thing you want to do is have your little Harry come to the summer camp, and then you're handing little Harry back in three pieces back to his parents at the end of the week, because that doesn't go down well with parents, for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
Here's your child. But yeah, as I think listeners will realize, I enjoyed my summer camps, but it wasn't entirely me, really. But if we go back on this issue to 2007 and those days, the big question is, how has child safety been the thing that has been allowed to slip? How has it been, going back to what we could have done differently, how can it be that the thing the society, the culture was most concerned about, which was protecting children, how come the debate around that was stopped? And how come one conclusion, one answer to that question was allowed to be for so long? So that really, really struck me, Ben.
There's one one particular point I'd like to ask you about in response to that, Tom. Actually, that I think is quite interesting. When would you say honestly that you started to become aware of trans issues as a kind of major cultural, social, political debate? When was it first on your radar, do you think?
For me, I think it was, listeners, viewers may not know, I used to be quite a major donor to Stonewall in the 2000s. So we're talking, significant amount per month. I was invited to a major donor event. And at that major donor event, fabulously, we were given a glass of wine and we were given some nibbles and sandwiches. It was a great evening, chatting away, networking, all that good stuff. And but the big driver of that particular evening was that Stonewall were changing their strap line, their marketing. So it had been, some people are gay, get over it. And that was on buses, it was on T-shirts, it was on hoodies, it was everywhere. It was on pride marches. Some people are gay, get over it, which is a kind of really straight, there you go, this is the way some people are, deal with it. And it was fine. It was a great strap line. And what was happening at that moment is that was changing to come out for LGBT. That was the new strap line. So this would have been about 2016, 17, around that time.
Yeah.
And that was the point of that evening that I attended, was to be one of the first people to hear that change. And on that evening, I thought, oh, that's interesting. Be good to see, the next phase of what Stonewall will do, and carry on with the good work. And so I think that's when I first became aware of this change of direction. But it was pretty soon after that that I realized this was going to open up all sorts of areas that actually were not being debated. So 16, 17. But interesting. Why do you ask the question, Ben?
Well, I think it's just, I suppose there are two elements to it. There's firstly, when did when did people start to think through the implications of this? So I remember, growing up in the 2000s, there'd be kind of, there might be a trans character in a soap opera in Coronation Street or whatever, and the message in that was very much. I mean, to paraphrase, you might say some people are trans, get over it. It was just about tolerance for people who live their lives in a kind of unorthodox way that most people would find a bit odd, but would not want to wish ill to that person. And then obviously it's transitioned from that request for tolerance to a demand for unquestioning compliance, and that obviously is something that then has had huge implications for freedom of speech. I remember, for my part, I think it was probably around the same time, actually, Tom, I was speaking to a couple of friends, colleagues from a former job, both women about my age, and we were just talking about these issues. And I said, well, and this was still at a time where people were sort of willing to talk about it. It was before the chilling effect had really set in for most people. So there wasn't this sense that there was, say, by 2019, that you just can't talk about this. You can't talk about it. And obviously then forced data comes along, and that changes a bit. But it was still at that time where people could have kind of private conversations about this. You wouldn't talk about it at work, obviously, but you might do in the pub afterwards. And it just came up as a topic of conversation. And I said, well, I completely reject the idea that you can change your sex, but people obviously can live their lives in their own way. It's not really any of my business. But the thing that concerns me about it is that it does seem to be getting quite dogmatic, and people obviously are, getting a little bit hesitant about wanting to express their views about this. So it was about that same kind of time, Tom, which actually I think lots of academics would probably point to 2016 as the year when woke really takes off. Obviously, you have Brexit, you have Trump, and then you have this kind of this progressive, ultra progressive woke backlash to that. Amidst the spectre of fascism, as certain progressives see it. So it all seemed to radicalize at that kind of time, didn't it?
Dr. David Bell was one of the panelists last week, and he was, in fact, a staff governor at the Tavistock Clinic. And he said something that really stayed with me, Ben, and resonates with what you've just said. So when did this start, and how exactly did this no debate thing happen around that time as well? And he said he's been past president of the British Psychoanalytic Society. He is a psychiatrist. He is a psychoanalyst. And he said that psychology or psychiatry has a dark episode within it. And I pricked up my ears at that point. What's he going to talk about? And what he was saying was he was going back to the treatment of gay men in particular in the 50s, the 60s, and obviously before, you get back to Oscar Wilde, he gets thrown into jail. And that dark episode and that desire to sort of come to terms with it and ensure that history would never be repeated in an area of medical care, he said, was one of the big drivers of the conversations in corridors between professionals, saying, well, we mustn't make that mistake again, because we really mucked up for decades there. We destroyed lives. And there was this great fear that might happen again. So that was a really powerful point, because you don't often link that to a whole profession and how they are kind of living with their own, they're haunted as a profession by where they went wrong in the past and trying to work out how they make sure they don't do the same thing again. And you can see that being a very, very significant spectre in the whole professional conversation, I think.
And I think that's true in politics as well. And certainly conservative politicians who have been or tended towards the pro-trans rights side of this argument, I think certainly would phrase it in terms of in the 80s, the Tories had Section 28. It was absolutely awful. We never want to go back to that. And any kind of restriction on talking about gender ideology to young children, it brings back this spectre of Section 28 and this horror story in it, and it's this sort of morality play in the minds of conservative politicians of that sort of, I was about to say bent, which would have been an unfortunate choice of words, Tom.
Great film. It's a great film.
But I think similarly that there is this sense of this is exactly the same as that. We must never have that kind of awful reaction to it again, and we've got to be on the right side of history, whatever that is, which has led so many people astray because it's such a simplistic and overly simplistic way of thinking about these things, and the horrendous downsides to this and the consequences of it were set out very convincingly by the panelists at the event we held.
A butterfly effect seems to have been something that's been in the background as well here, because one of the other things they made is the points that was made on the evening, and I can't remember which panelist made it, was that the Tavistock Clinic, so the GIDS part of Tavistock, which is the gender identity services part for children and young people, was actually housed down the road in sort of a high street shop kind of unit away from the main building of the Tavistock. And this was the early days when there were only 6 or 7 people in the GIDS unit. And the fact was that in and of itself had a huge subconscious effect over time, because they were the curiosity down the road. And if part members of that unit then wanted to go and talk to other professionals at the Tavistock who might not even be in psychiatry at all, or in gender services, then they'd have to go out the door, turn right, go down the road, turn right. And of course, that means that those casual conversations, and in fact that sort of protective professional layer, is detached, at least temporarily, from what's going on in the shop on the high street. So, one can never know how much being geographically located
Yeah.
away might have done. But I think that's just a small piece of maybe why some of these things happened. Had such small differences in the first instance back in 2007. Such small things actually ballooned into something that became out of control. And of course, at the same time, because they were the curiosity down the street, a lot of the other professionals would say, "Oh, well, I don't want to get involved.
Yeah.
Not my problem." And not even just because they're down the street, but it was a bit of a curiosity. And so when concerns were raised, I'm going to stick to my thing over here. And again, I think one of the points that was made is that when it comes to whistleblowing, raising concerns, you absolutely need to have that person who is outside the system that you're in, who makes the final decision on a whistle blowing situation. I mean, I think that's happened in finance for a while. You have someone you go to who's not in your department, but in
Yeah.
medicine, similarly, it ought to be that kind of safety net.
A while ago, Tom, I think probably back in January, you made the comparison to the ITV drama about Mr. Bates versus the post office. And I think certainly listening to the panelists, considering just how long this has been going on for, I mean, this stuff was not on my radar in 2005, 2006. It just wasn't. But all of it was bubbling away and building up. And it's taken the best part of 20 years for some of these reports and for some of the concerns whistleblowers had to actually see the light of day. And it seems strikingly similar to the kind of scandals that have been in the news in the last year, the infected blood scandal, the post office and Horizon and so on. And there just seems to be this terrible institutional inertia and protectiveness. And there's no view to what the common good is. There's no view towards public interest. It's entirely about institutions protecting their fiefdom, their reputation, and trying to stay out of the headlines, and trying to protect themselves from negative publicity with appalling human consequences, as in the Tavistock, as in the post office scandal. And it just seems, I don't know what it is. It just seems to be the same phenomenon playing out in all of these institutions, where there is just this cowardice, and this warped sense of what your priorities are as a leader of an NHS Foundation Trust or a hospital or the post office.
It's an extraordinarily difficult nut to crack. I'm sure it's not new in any way at all. I think institutions through history have struggled with this. But one point that was made again last week was money, and the fact that where does the money go? Follow the money. Where does the money come from? What are you cutting off if you speak out? What grants? I think it was mentioned the National Lottery is behind so many organizations now. The scrutiny isn't always there for where that money is going. And it's often very one-sided, of course, because of the culture war behind it. But money both at the sort of institutional level, so what funding and grants might be cut off by being on the wrong side of this discussion, but also at the micro level, at the individual level, and the reality of, hang on, I've got a mortgage to pay. I can't lose this job.
Yeah.
So I think the point about money was very well made in terms of both where the grants come from, whether it's national or other sort of organizations, and where the salary continues to come from for the individuals and the professionals involved. And again, I think it was Dr. David Bell who said that, he was retired when he finally decided he was going to become a whistleblower at the Tavistock. He was retired. There was a sense of he didn't need to care anymore. And as he was saying that, I thought, that the model there is the non-executive director. The non-executive director is there, stood outside the business, comes in as a sort of independent set of eyes,
Yeah.
isn't reliant upon the salary from that organization. Obviously gets a bit of money for sitting on the board and taking on risk. But the non-executive director is an extraordinarily important role, especially the INEDs, the independent non-executive directors. Because often you have non-executive directors who come from another part of the group. So they might be, for large complex conglomerates, the non-execs will just be flown over from America and the American group and sit on the board to take up a seat. But actually, you want an independent non-executive director. But the risk now is so high as well. If you turn up on a board, you're not being paid that much money, and it all goes wrong. You're on the hook as well as a director, and yet you won't have the optics into the business that the execs do. So the execs, if they're bad actors, like hiding a report that's been written, for example, will be able to do that. So that's another tough path to walk, I think.
There's been none of the scrutiny. I always like the CIA had this unit called Team B during the Cold War, whose job it was basically to kind of debunk the working assumptions that the CIA was using when it was assessing Soviet military strength and intentions and foreign policy priorities and so on. Institutions really do need a B team type individual, non-executive director, whoever, and a culture which is open to correction. And of course, this is the whole point of freedom of speech. It's nice to have for its own sake, but you also get better outcomes because you actually have the debates. You have a working scientific method. You have open inquiry, and you have people within the workplace who are able to say, actually, I think that's completely insane, and here's why. And when that just falls away, this is the disaster you get. The other thing I'd say, Tom, is going back to the example of the post office or infected blood or whatever. Each of these things, as in the Tavistock and the NHS approach to gender medicine, if it takes 15 or 20 years for some of this to come to light, what's going on now that isn't going to come into the public eye for another 15 or 20 years? I mean, you dread to think, don't you?
Yeah, we used to call it the IBNR in general insurance, just the incurred but not reported claims in insurance. The stuff is happening now.
Yeah.
The claims are happening now. They're being incurred, but we don't know about them. They haven't been uncovered. Like asbestos claims back in the 1950s and the 1960s. No one knew that it was killing people. And your point about the blood. I mean, I wonder whether the key here is whether people understand how high the stakes are. We talk about aviation a lot in terms of risk management. Talk about wartime. Your point about the CIA is well made. Why do those systems seem to work? Why do those systems seem to provide true audit and resilience into a system? Because the stakes are so high. Because a plane falling out the sky will destroy a business because it's killing people and trust. Because during a war, you could lose the war, and you're all on the same side. I think there's a sense of not realizing with this issue of gender ideology how high the stakes were. If people had realized the disaster that it would lead to for individual lives, wrecking people, we talk about the detransitioners came up a lot last week. If people had realized the stakes were so high, and we're talking, and another thing that was raised was the children's books that are now in schools and libraries, all one-sided, all indoctrination, and the people like Rachel Rooney, who's written a book on the other side, end up being sort of treated really badly, and sort of bullied out of the public square. I think there hasn't been a realization of how high the stakes are. And again, when Professor Michelle Morse spoke, you got a real sense there last week of the how her life had been so profoundly impacted. Yes, she'd come out the other side stronger and with new allies and new friends and new networks and all of the stuff that was good about last week, when we pulled the panel together. But she'd gone through fire,
Yeah.
absolute fire, being torn to shreds, put basically into bits before being having to reconstruct her life and reconstruct herself. And so, yeah, I think that sense of the stakes that are
Yeah.
in play is something that gets forgotten as
And,
well.
and of course, none of this really is it's impossible to say actually it's complete result, because the Cass report, Baroness Cass is now is an incredibly important turning point. But in terms of freedom of speech, which of course is our professional political interest in this debate, whatever our own views about trans medicine and how it's treated children and so on, sticking to the freedom of speech point, you and I, Tom, and our colleagues are well aware that just in the NHS alone, ignoring other sectors and private sector and other parts of public sector, just in the NHS alone, we still have dozens of cases coming to us each year of people who need our help in all different parts of the NHS across the country, whether it's doctors or administrative staff or nurses or whoever. And we can't talk about our ongoing cases where they're not in the public domain for obvious confidentiality reasons. But we have, I think, about 145 open cases on our books right now. Many of those concern the NHS. And so I think actually we're still in a position where leaders within the NHS, as elsewhere too, are not willing to accept dissent, are not willing to tolerate critical voices within their organisation, and don't have the character to see the benefit of allowing an internal culture where people are able to speak their mind and say, actually, boss, I'm not sure we've got that right.
Another thing that struck me last week, and I think the video, hopefully, but the video of that evening will be out very soon. And
Yeah.
even when this episode comes out, hopefully it will be out on the freespeechunion.org website. So, anyone who's able to do have a look at that. But another phrase that jumped out at me was purity spiral,
Yes.
Ben. This idea that the reason debate's been stifled is because there is a new puritanical streak, and it's not just a streak; it's kind of the whole house is puritanical. When we talk about the NHS, there is a puritanism about what view one must take on the transgender issue. But the point that was being made is we mustn't get into a purity spiral where both sides are becoming puritanical. And we saw some of it in the room, which I thought was really interesting, where people were standing up. There was one person who stood up and said, I'm really worried about young people who want to change their gender. And they were shouted down. They were saying, sex.
Yeah.
And I thought, I didn't think much of it at the time. I just thought, oh, okay, yeah, okay. The room's responded, which you can totally understand, given these are, the room was full of people who are absolutely at the sharp end of what all of this means. But the panel member was saying, let's just remember this risk of a purity spiral, that we don't want to become as puritanical as we find our way through this as the ideologues are.
Yeah.
And it's such a risk when you know it's a fight. So first of all, people don't believe it's a fight. But when you know it's a fight, and everyone in the room, everyone online listening to that could not walk away from that panel and not say this was a fight. This is an ongoing fight. There's one side and there's another side. And it has to be that the right side wins this for the sake of everyone, for children, for free expression, for freedom. But as we're in that, the risk is that we ourselves become puritanical. The risk is that we ourselves police language. The risk is that we ourselves shut down debate and forget to recreate the kind of format and
Yeah.
backdrop that we need to move on from all of this in a healthy way and actually regroup together, because there'll be a lot of people, we hope, over the next 5 years, 10 years, who might have been on the ideologue side, who suddenly go, I got it wrong. I
Yeah.
got it wrong. And they're still going to be using the wrong language as they go on that journey. They're still, because they'll have been swimming in that forever. They're going to get it, they're going to get the language completely wrong because they're going from one side to another. But we need to get back together when
Yeah.
that happens.
I think, I mean, actually, I know just from speaking to so many people who've been punished for their views, their sex realist views or their gender critical views. Um, even those terms, actually, I was speaking to somebody at the drinks reception after the event who said to me, I don't like the term gender critical, I don't use it. And I use the term sex realist, which, actually, I agree. I think that the term gender critical, I've spoken to people who just have no idea what that means, and it's a phrase that doesn't necessarily explain itself. And I've spoken to people who thought that if you were gender critical, that meant you were a misogynist, and that gender critical person must be somebody who didn't like women, and was sexist. And there's all sorts of misunderstandings about what this term means. It's not a brilliant turn of phrase, it has to be said. So even at the kind of the top level terminology, there are people who say, I just don't like that term. I prefer another one, which of course is completely fine. But when you get down to questions like, for instance, do you use a trans colleague's new pronouns in the workplace? There will be lots of people. I think probably a majority of the people that the Free Speech Union have spoken to who've needed help with this sort of thing, who will say something like, I'm happy to use their legal name. And that's often something we advise people to do, because it's not, calling somebody by a different name is not requiring you to manifest a belief. You're just using their legal name. Whereas using their new pronoun, referring to a biological male as she, is requiring you to say something that you don't believe. But within that debate, there will be, I think that there will be people who are quite happy to use a new pronoun out of politeness, while reserving the right to think privately, well, I don't really think you're a different gender or sex, but just on a sort of interpersonal level, I like you, I don't have any issue with you, I'm happy to use whatever pronoun you like. So there is just a broad spectrum of views about all of these things, and that point really stuck with me as well, Tom. And I thought the idea that there should be a purity spiral on the gender critical free speech side of this debate, I think that would be a pretty disastrous development. I think there has to be room for a broad coalition, I think.
And we fall into the trap ourselves. I often find, because we're talking, you and me, we do various things and go on to different radio shows and whatnot, and think about our talking points, what we want to say. Can never predict how a conversation is going to go. So you kind of think, well, if that happens, I'll say that, and then something completely unexpected happens. And before you know it, you come off the radio show and you replay it in your mind, and you suddenly think, hang on, I've become idealistic on one side of the debate because I'm so used to arguing it from that side. And this doesn't necessarily need to be gender. It could be race. It could be religion. It could be whatever. And you suddenly think, am I actually kind of shutting down debate on the other side and using the same tactics subconsciously or even consciously? And I think we have to hold ourselves accountable, don't we? We almost have to audit ourselves and say, hang on, am I holding to my own principles here? Or am I at risk of becoming, running the same arguments without letting them bypass my brain, like a lecturer in a
Yeah.
university. It goes from the lecturer's notes to the student's notes without going through either brain. It's very easy to bypass the brain when you run the same arguments many, many times.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because you can get into a trap of using a kind of heuristic, can't you? Of if this person I admire thinks this about issue A, I'm going to agree with them about issue B, which I think is how. I think probably for evolutionary reasons that is just how we do a lot of our subconscious thinking.
Yeah.
And of course we're innately tribal, so there's always going to be an element of that. But I'm always a bit suspicious, and I think we've spoken about. I think we actually disagreed about this Tom slightly in an episode a few months ago.
No, we didn't.
Yeah, but I'm always slightly wary of people where you learn what their view is about one issue, and then if you're able to extrapolate what all of their views are about everything else from that one starting point. So it in American politics, for instance, it seems a complete nonsense that if you know what somebody's views are about gun control, you should be able to work out what their views are about climate change. But I would predict that 85% of the time, if you knew that somebody was strongly opposed to gun control, you would be able to predict that they were opposed to taking action about climate change, or whatever. Because those issues are unrelated, and you can just see that so often when people come to those kind of conclusions, they're relying on a heuristic. And it's a tribal way of thinking, which you're right. I think we probably all do that some of the time, but there's something satisfying about it.
But interestingly, Ben, and this is another reason why I would encourage all listeners and viewers to go back and have a look at the video from last week's panel that Jan McVerridge put together. Something I thought about that panel is there's so evidently people coming from completely different perspectives on different issues. And actually, there's a moment when one of the panelists says something that I thought, oh, okay, we don't hear that very often on I think it was on Israel-Palestine, a position from the other side from what we would normally hear. And I thought, I think for that reason alone, bringing a panel like that together, it shows what the power of being forced to think through a very specific issue that is doing real damage to free expression. Clearly, the debate is over. Brings together people from different tribes, from different camps, and forces the breaking down of those walls. And I thought that is what you get when you get people who are in the heat of the battle or come out of the heat of battle and really know what it's like. That the hot center of a cultural debate.
Yeah.
And I thought it was really powerful, actually. I think it's that next layer out when you're a commentator in the commentariat thinking about the issue that you're at risk of short-circuiting your thought process. But when you're at the hub, you're at risk of being broken, and so you're forced to think about the issues in a very distinct way.
Yeah, I couldn't put it better myself, Tom.
Yeah. Shall we move on to one other item, Ben, or did you want to say anything else about the evening we had last week?
No, I think I just encourage people to go and watch it. It was really brilliant. We have. I think we can praise our colleague Jan McVerridge, our event director, who puts on some fantastic stuff, and always glad to go along whenever I can to see what people are talking about. It was really great to go and listen to it.
It would stand out. Yeah, it was stand out as an event.
We want to have a grumble now, don't we, Tom?
We want to have a grumble. We wanted to talk about a very famous feminist writer, Virginia Woolf. Who's afraid of Virginia Woolf, Ben? We all are. One of the Bloomsbury set. And this caught our eye. This is a week or so ago, where Labour-run Camden Council has added the digital tag, a QR code, on Virginia Woolf's monument in Bloomsbury, central London. And that tag, that QR code, takes you to a bit of text that outlines Woolf's imperialist attitudes. And the measure is, surprise, surprise, it's part of a scheme called Representing Bloomsbury, where the re is at the front and then you've got a capital P, Representing Bloomsbury. And it was drawn up in the wake of Black Lives Matters protests, and it was backed by National Lottery cash to address the connections between local statues and racism, slavery, and imperialism. But what's heartening about this, of course, that makes a little piece of us die, doesn't it? Because it's this recasting of our greatest and our best. We're always going for our heroes, whether it's Churchill, whether it's Nelson, now it's Virginia Woolf, it was Enid Blyton, it's been P.G. Wodehouse, they've all been kind of put up in the dock, a bit like Oliver Cromwell. What was it? 2 years after he'd been buried, they dug him back up and they cut his head off and they hanged him.
Quite right, Tom.
Quite right too. Yeah, I mean that's the exception. That's fine.
I think we're on
But
different sides on the English Civil War, aren't we, Tom? I think we've discovered this at some point.
I think
Anyway,
we
go
are.
on.
Yeah,
Sorry, go on.
I think. Yeah, yeah. But I'm
We
all
can
for
be friends.
Parliament, but I prefer the feathers in the hats. But it's that kind of posthumous recasting of people and our greatest heroes. But what is really good about this is that it's outraged Virginia Woolf's great niece, Emma Woolf, who wrote on X, "You couldn't make it up. The Wokerati of Camden Council have decided that this statue of my great aunt, Virginia Woolf in Bloomsbury, needs a QR code to explain her offensive attitudes." Just to be clear, this was a woman born in 1882. Are they expecting her to trot out the wokery of 2024? Virginia was a feminist, socially progressive, a literary pioneer, politically active, Fabian Society, etc. She was way ahead of her time in so many ways. And here, there's a picture in the article. There's a picture of the great niece, Emma Woolf, and she's obviously young. She's not my generation, maybe not even your generation, Ben. But you think, yeah, great. Someone standing up and saying, "Stop it. Just stop the madness. I want to get off."
Well, I think it can be taken as read, Tom, that I will completely agree with your analysis of that. But one thing about it that struck me as being quite darkly comic is that the people who've done this will be so full of self-righteousness and thinking that they are at the cutting edge of history. They're on the right side of history again. And in fact, what they're doing, this desecration of statues, is something that people have been doing for thousands of years. It's damnatio memoriae. It's exactly the same thing that people have always been doing, chiseling off praise from plaques or statues when people fall out of favor in the eyes of posterity. It's an ancient practice. But the difference this time is that because they have relied on a QR code to do it, their damnation is actually not going to outlast the statue, because, like all technology, it's going to become obsolete. I mean, it's like trying to find information off a floppy disk or a VHS cassette. It will take quite a lot of effort for somebody to do that. And I think it's foolhardy to imagine that in 20 years people will still know what a QR code is. And so it just seems quite funny. I mean, it's almost like having a sort of dispenser of floppy disks where you can download a Word document, which will have a sort of condemnation of her. It will be completely obsolete. And so I just think there's something quite hubristic about this, which I thought was quite funny. I mean, my first reaction was, "Oh, for God's sake, this is completely ridiculous." But once I thought about it a bit more, there's a whole extra layer of ludicrousness to this situation, to this story.
Well, the hubristic cut, the hubris cuts every way in this story.
I wasn't going to take you out of your misery then, Tom.
Yeah, no, you didn't save me there. There was no life belt coming my way. When you think about who could write like Virginia Woolf, who could think like Virginia, these activists who are doing this, or these council members who are doing this, do they have even an ounce of the intellect and the perspicacity of Virginia Woolf? Do they have any of her qualities, of her ability to stand up alone before women's suffrage and make these points so eloquently in the ways that she did? So much so that "Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf" is now a cultural meme, because she was so good at standing up and saying what she thought in a unique way. And so the hubris is everywhere in this story. And we've spoken about it before with other authors, but it really irritates me when these half-witted counsellors decide that they're going to be judge and jury over some of our greatest cultural heroes.
I think half-witted is probably generous, Tom. I'm just wondering,
it depends which half.
my little joke statue of Julius Caesar up here, which is a gift from a friend. It's a pencil holder, so you stab him in the back to put the pencils in there. There are little holes for it there. But I'm wondering if I turn it upside down, if there will be a QR code, I can scan it, so I can find out what Brutus thought about Julius Caesar. Maybe there should be. I'll check afterwards. I'll see.
You should check
Yeah.
afterwards. Yeah, Brutus wasn't in the end a great fan, despite
No,
being an
I think that's
adopted
fair.
son.
I think that's fair to say.
But yeah, that's a different story, isn't it, for a different day?
I'll report back.
But I think that's all we've got for this week. I hope,
Yeah.
unless you've got anything else.
Well, no,
Ben?
hopefully England have won. I mean, this is the terrible suspense, and once again, every time we record an episode early, we're massive hostages to fortune. Whether it's about the election campaign,
You were convinced it was going to be November.
right? Yeah. So we've got no idea, and I hope people are triumphantly celebrating in the comments below this, because we have no idea at all. It's horrible.
No idea. We're the past. We're the past. We're a different country, Ben.
Yeah.
We're a foreign country. We do things differently here. But yeah, so we wish all of our listeners a fantastic week, and we'll speak to you next week.
Good luck, everyone.